Okay, thank you, Stefan. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, my name is René van der Velde. I'm responsible or pushing, worrying this topic further. I'd like to especially start with welcoming our three special guests who are giving us a lecture today. Professor Ellen Bray from Copenhagen, Professor Sonja Dubbelman from Munich, and Gerben de Vries, who's the director of Functional Markets, and will be giving us a lecture as well. My job is to give a bit of an introduction to their work, because that's kind of like the body of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And then there's something else happening at the end. We want to have a discussion with some experts from the Netherlands and also with you as a public to discuss what this might become as an initiative, as an agenda, as a movement, perhaps not, in the Netherlands. What that could involve. So we have international perspective, and we have a national perspective, and we have a national discussion, a local discussion to go with it. So I called my introduction Trajectories as a kind of trajectories plural, ways in looking at forest urbanism, and a praxis of symbiosis. And this symbiosis has to do with the fact that, of course, city and forest are, in most of our minds, two very different things. One, a lot of bricks and mortar and roads, and the other is natural environment outside the city. So how would you bring these two together? This symbiosis is a good term to think firstly about how that might appear. We see this a lot in science coming up now, with more and more fields coming together. Neurobiology, for instance, is a new field which combines things together. Science, practice is moving all the time, and so this questions whether or not we should be incorporating forest and city together more. And I'll show you why, and I will show you why actually that's already been done historically for quite a long time. So it's the last in a series which Stefan just mentioned as well, and that it's probably the most speculative, you could say. And if I could be that summarily, Stefan, I could say we have landscape-based urbanism as a solid basis of what we've been doing for at least a number of decennia. Ecological urbanism with Nico's presentation a few weeks ago, and the group discussed a lot of those new things which we're working solidly on, ecology in cities as ecologies. And forest urbanism as kind of like the most perhaps speculative and new version. So it could be a variation, but it's also related to those two, of course. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But it could be something different, something new, something extra, which has some certain kinds of potential. We work on this notion of open forestry in a cluster, in a group of researchers here at the faculty, and that group is not so much dedicated to urban forestry, just that, but has for various reasons different interests in this topic of city and trees, city and forest. They come from landscape architecture, but also from environmental technology and design. We're also working with industrial design, and also with some of the more social sciences, for instance, and beyond the faculty and the university. And we work on 7 topics, 7 clusters of projects, from tree architecture, which is sort of more the height we're looking at what trees are, through to mobile urban forestry, and everything between, such as the history of the urban forest, data and tools. And forest urbanism is sitting in the middle of it all, because we're in an urbanism department, and it's the kind of thing that we'd like to tease out more as a kind of future trajectory. So we're really looking forward to discussions with our department and with the faculty and with the outside world about what this might be. So let's look at this idea of the urban forest and look at this idea of urban forestry and forest urbanism particularly. So here we have an image on the left here of our usual image of Europe, all the different forests that we have covering this part of the continent, and the cities in black. So this is our depictions, our mappings of how we understand the territory at a European level. But if you zoom in to a part of the territory here, where we are now, this part of the territory, the western part of the Netherlands, where do we see the trees? Where do we see the forest? Not in the countryside, but in the cities. The forests are largely the cities themselves. So this strange paradox, which has, of course, to do with the landscape type which we have in this country, part of the country, but also the fact that there's been a long, long history of planting trees and working with trees in cities, to the extent that if you zoom out, you might say they're hybrid kind of forest types. So this same zoom-in exercise can be done in Germany and Denmark and all over the continent, which will rephrase what we consider forest and where the trees are and what they're doing. So this is a kind of like a first macro image. And the second thing you can say here is if there is a culture and a kind of interrelationship, there already is a symbiosis of these two things together. Why do we know more about them? And what might we do to expand them? And you can say quite simply, we could just expand this condition and expand the forest and expand what we're trying to do with all the problems we have, such as housing, forestry, etc. So it's a kind of a provocative idea, and based on what we could say is reality at the moment. Let's zoom in a little bit more and then zoom back out again. If you look at this urban forest that we talk about in the Netherlands, like I said, there's a tree cultus, you could almost call it, at least a couple of centuries in the Netherlands. Here, this beautiful painting by René of the part of Delft here close by with the trees along the elms along the house. 80 million trees in the city, in the urban forest, one for each of the population. 16.4% crown cover, around about average in all of the cities. So if you take them all together, you reach that crown cover. That's almost double what's standard understood as this idea of forest, 10% tree cover. In total, 30,000 hectares, which happens to be about 10% of what we normally consider our natural forest cover in the Netherlands. But it doesn't register yet on the figures, national figures. So you could add this to this figure. And to give you, for those of you who know the Netherlands a bit, the relationship between 30,000 hectares and the Utrechtse Heuvelrug, which is this little bit of forest here, not so cool, and Gerald will talk a bit more about it later. It's double that. So that's 18,000 hectares. It's almost double that forest. That's quite a bit already. The second thing is this idea of reimagining it. So what we've done until now with the group and what we talked about last year in this session was not just what do we have, but what is that symbiosis which we already have at all kinds of levels in Delft and every other city. What does that offer in terms of ways of thinking about modes of practice, about building, about planning, etc., of our cities in the future? And these are mere speculations, although this one I'll talk about in a minute. It's a bit more of a speculation from an architect, an urbanist, an architect, and a student, looking at ways that this idea of the urban forest might become more than that, might become actually a model for the city. And at different levels, from the building scale through to the urban region scale. So this, as a kind of let's say perspective for the future, we used to organize our last meeting. So we're here a year ago. We talked about with a few different people from both academia and from Praxis. We looked at this idea of forest urbanism. with Wim van Berg, who has done this fantastic study of the moving urban forest of Flanders, which pretty much 200 years of this kind of dynamic relationship, almost a dance between city and forest. Margarita Yoba, who showed us work that she's doing in Spain in terms of looking at how we can understand different cities as forests and the edges of those forests. We're three of the, you say, tree officers of the Netherlands looking at different kinds of things that they were doing in terms of layouts of new urban extensions, or rethinking parts of the city, or rethinking what actually a forest might be at the edge of the city. And we had this interesting project we talked about briefly about, which is the city proposal by MVRDV for a new suburb in Almere. And this one was particularly speculative because it looked at this idea of creating a new city, or a new city quarter, a new city district. Here you can see that city district, which is a patch within the Almere region. It was a Floriada exhibition area, and now it's going to become a neighborhood, a fully fledged neighborhood, or you can say almost a small city. And MVRDV came up with a scripting plan, very much about data and looking at flows of different things, of creating an early development model based on the forest. So if we took different kinds of inputs and outputs, which we normally find in a normal forest situation, what might that mean in terms of resources, in terms of flows, in terms of forms, etc. And then they come up with a series of possible outcomes for each of the blocks here. It's highly speculative. It's probably going to become fairly traditional, this neighborhood. MVRDV are not working on it anymore. But this approach was quite interesting because it looked at these data things. And their imagery, which showed what potentially could be, gave this kind of impression of that kind of city. So we then decided that, or we concluded a couple of things. One was that from the landscape-based urbanism approach, which we started with in Stefan's set of lectures, looking at things like thinking big in terms of scale, region to locality, those ideas of from a design perspective. We can add to that rewriting the biocity as a wooded environment. We can also add to that for design as shaping this multi-species woodland in some way as a biocity. And in terms of design and planning processes that utilize knowledge, we can add to that the forest urban perspective, engaging urban and natural systems in a novel forest complex, and this idea of processes of growth and change also as part of as a particular forest flavor. And then we also had some inputs on the research side of things. So we said, what don't we know yet in terms of forest urbanism? What do we still need to research? And there we came up with, or we concluded that mapping the development of cities and woodlands is something we should know a lot more about, and understanding this urban natural system as a novel forest complex. So not a traditional forest, but as this novel hybrid forest complex. Do we know enough about that, and how does that work? I'm sure we'll be talking a bit more about that today, so that's, I'm looking forward to that. And lastly, if we talk about the space, this we had from landscape-based urbanism, we do this already, looking at landscape patterns, regional natural green system networks, metropolitan park systems. We can say maybe we should also understand the spatial differentiation of green space as a wooded environment, and what those tools and methodologies and strategies might be that complement those. So, without much further ado, I'm going to wrap up. We're moving now to two more angles, likely European angles, or likely it's nice that we've got some very different European angles, which I just briefly introduced. So the first will be from Sonia, who is looking at both not just from a German perspective, but internationally as well in what she's doing. She's called A History in 5 Places. And Ellen, who will zoom into the Danish situation, looking at what the term coexistence, what that actually might mean, and is there a genealogy of that building? And then we finish with some very exciting new projects that Gerwin and his team at Fox are working on, thinking about what's actually happening in the Netherlands in terms of now and might happen. And they've been doing some very interesting speculative work, sort of, you could call it unsolicited design, which is really nice. This office as being as a proactive kind of thinking office. What if we do this? What would happen? And those results he's going to share with us. And they have specifically to do with these 2 very urgent problems, which are like elephants in the room, and we tend to dance about them and dance around them, but we do need to solve them very, very quickly. And it's at a basically programmatic level. We have 10% or 30,000 hectares of forest to plant very quickly by 2030. Visualized here how much forest that actually is for the future. And we have almost 1 million houses, dwellings, which urgently need to be built. Also from a political stability perspective, which we've just seen, these issues are very urgent and are becoming more urgent. And where are we going to put them? And how quickly? And how might we combine these 2 in a perhaps radical and unconventional way, but perhaps also very interesting way? So that's the kind of call out that's being proposed here. I'm speculatively saying there are 3 flavors which might come out of today, but perhaps there are 4 or 5 more different flavors for the Netherlands. Then the first might be looking at new thinkings about forests which are far away from the city, but are still related to the city in terms of wood production or food production or recreation, etc. So how they might be interrelated or react to each other, how we might actually make them work more symbiotically. The second is forests and woodlands right around the cities, in the vicinity of cities. Delft is a perfect example, has been very proactive in creating forests all around. And in the meantime, we're now talking about many interurban forests. So what do they look like and what do they do? And lastly, possibly the most radical is this idea of the city as a forest. So not the thing itself as an object, but the place where we are in the city as a We want to finish then with a panel. And the panel I'll introduce a little bit later from different angles, from different perspectives, talking about 4 things. What is this thing, and this urban forest, this forest urbanism notion? So what potential does it have, and what could we call it? So there are different angles we're looking at. The objectives, some concrete objectives. What kinds of things might we want to do with it, quantitatively and qualitatively? Guidelines, so looking at some concrete principles about if we're going to make some of these new forest urbanisms, what should be the principles we're following, and who's going to do which thing when, kind of like a delegation discussion about what could possibly who could possibly take which steps. And there I want to leave my short introduction. I hope it was a little bit less short than I thought, but I hope we're still in time, and ask Sonia to come to the front and give us your presentation.